I stepped out of the white Honda Civic, adjusting the small gift bag in my hands as the Uber driver pulled away from the curb. The familiar two-story colonial house stood before me, its red brick facade and white shutters unchanged since my childhood. Sunday dinners at Grandpa and Grandma's place had been our family tradition for over 2 decades. I walked up the stone pathway, breathing in the scent of autumn leaves scattered across their perfectly manicured lawn. The front door swung open before I could ring the bell, revealing my grandfather David's weathered face. His bright blue eyes immediately scanned past me toward the empty driveway, confusion creasing his brow. "Mason, why are you arriving in an Uber? What happened to that brand-new Honda Pilot we bought you for your 24th birthday last month?" Before I could even process his words or formulate a response, my mother Linda appeared beside him in the doorway, that unnaturally bright smile spreading across her face like paint on canvas. Her sister needed it more, she announced with false cheer. Every person on that front porch turned to stone. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Grandpa's expression shifted from confusion to something I had never witnessed before, a cold calculation that made my stomach drop. I followed them inside, where the rest of our family had already gathered in the spacious living room. Dad sat rigid in his usual leather armchair, his newspaper folded, but unread in his lap. Aunt Sarah occupied the floral sofa next to my cousin Jessica, who seemed unusually fixated on her phone screen. Grandma Helen emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a blue checkered apron. "Well, come sit down, everyone." Grandma called, her voice carrying that forced normalcy I recognized from tense family situations. We moved toward the dining room, where the mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandelier. The familiar aroma of roast beef and mashed potatoes filled the air, but my appetite had completely vanished. As we settled into our assigned seats, I found myself directly across from Jessica, who still refused to make eye contact. Something felt wrong about her posture, the way she favored her left arm and kept her right wrist close to her body. A thin line of fading purple marked her cheekbone, barely concealed beneath foundation. "So, Mason," Aunt Sarah began cutting into her roast beef with deliberate precision, "how are you managing transportation these days?" The question felt loaded like ammunition waiting to explode. I glanced around the table, noting how everyone except Grandpa seemed to avoid looking directly at me. "I've been using ride shares and public transit for about 3 weeks now," I replied carefully. "Ever since the SUV disappeared from my apartment parking lot." "Disappeared." Grandpa's voice cut through the clatter of silverware like a blade. Mom's laugh sounded artificial, rehearsed. "Oh, you know how dramatic Mason can be. We simply redirected the vehicle to where it was needed most urgently." Jessica finally looked up from her plate, and I caught sight of the medical bracelet around her wrist. The pieces began forming a picture I did not want to see. "What happened to your Jeep Cherokee?" I asked directly. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jessica's face flushed crimson, and she looked desperately toward her mother for rescue. Sarah cleared her throat, launching into what sounded like a prepared speech about minor accidents and insurance complications. "It was just a little fender bender," Sarah insisted, her voice rising slightly. "Nothing serious, but the repair shop needed the car for several weeks, and Jessica has that new position at the marketing firm downtown." Grandpa set down his fork with a sharp clink against the porcelain plate. "When exactly did this fender bender occur?" More uncomfortable, shifting around the table. Dad finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "About a month ago, late on a Saturday night." I studied Jessica's face as the timeline crystallized. A month ago would have been right around my birthday weekend, when the SUV had supposedly been temporarily relocated, according to the vague text message Mom had sent me. "Were you hurt in the accident?" I pressed. Jessica's composure cracked like an eggshell. Tears welled up in her brown eyes as she pushed back from the table. "I hit a telephone pole after leaving Murphy's Tavern," she whispered, her voice breaking. I had been drinking, and I shouldn't have been driving. The whole front end of my car was completely destroyed. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest as the full scope of the deception became clear. My family had orchestrated an elaborate cover-up, convincing my grandparents that I did not really need the graduation gift they had carefully selected and purchased for me, while simultaneously positioning Jessica as the victim who desperately required reliable transportation. "You gave away my SUV?" I said slowly, to cover up Jessica's drunk driving accident. Mom's mask finally slipped, revealing the defensive anger underneath. "That's an extremely unfair characterization of the situation. We made a practical decision that benefited everyone involved. Everyone except me," I replied, my voice steady despite the rage building inside my chest. Grandpa David had remained silent throughout this exchange, but I could see his jaw working as he processed each revelation. The man who had built a successful accounting practice from nothing, who had raised 3 children during the recession of the 1970s, was calculating something behind those sharp blue eyes. After dinner, Grandpa caught my arm as the others moved toward the living room for coffee and dessert. "Mason, I'd like to show you something in my study," he said quietly. The others seemed relieved to let us go, probably hoping the private conversation would diffuse the mounting tension. His study hadn't changed since I was a child. Dark oak bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on accounting, American history, and classic literature. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface meticulously organized with manila folders and neat stacks of documents. Family photographs in silver frames chronicled decades of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. Grandpa closed the door firmly behind us and gestured for me to sit in one of the burgundy leather chairs facing his desk. He pulled out a thick folder marked with my name in his precise handwriting. "I've been reviewing some family financial records lately." He began settling into his desk chair. "Your grandmother and I are updating our estate planning, which requires examining all the gifts and support we've provided over the years." He opened the folder, revealing bank statements, canceled checks, and handwritten ledgers that went back years. I started noticing some discrepancies that troubled me, patterns that didn't align with what I remembered about our financial support for you and Jessica. My stomach began to knot as he spread the documents across his desk like evidence in a courtroom. "This is your savings bond portfolio," he said, pointing to a statement from 2010. "We started this account when you were 8 years old, adding $100 every month for your future education expenses." I leaned forward to examine the numbers. The account had grown steadily until 2015, when large withdrawals began appearing every few months. By 2016, the balance had dropped to nearly zero. Where did that money go? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. Grandpa pulled out another set of documents, these showing Jessica's expenses during her high school years: dance lessons, cheerleading, camp competition fees, and travel costs for national tournaments. The amounts matched the withdrawals from my savings account almost exactly. Your parents explained that Jessica needed extra support for her extracurricular activities. Grandpa continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "They assured us you were more focused on academic achievements and didn't require the same level of financial investment." The room seemed to tilt as more pieces fell into place. I remembered asking my parents about college savings when I was a junior in high school, and they told me we needed to be realistic about our budget constraints. Meanwhile, Jessica had been receiving hundreds of dollars every month for activities I had never even known she was participating in. "There's more," Grandpa said grimly. He pulled out a thick stack of checks, all made out to my parents, with memo lines indicating Mason's college fund. The amounts were staggering, totaling over $20,000 across 4 years. "I wrote these checks specifically for your tuition and living expenses," he explained. "Your mother told me you were too proud to accept direct financial help, so I made them payable to your parents with the understanding they would handle the distribution discreetly. My hands began to shake as I held the evidence of systematic financial theft. During college, I had worked 3 part-time jobs, lived in the cheapest housing I could find, and survived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. I had assumed my grandparents believed in the value of hard work and self-sufficiency, never imagining they were actually sending money that never reached me. Meanwhile, Grandpa continued opening another folder. Jessica was receiving regular support for her apartment rent car payments, credit card bills, and what your mother described as educational investments in her various career explorations. He showed me receipts and bank transfers documenting payments for Jessica's failed attempt at cosmetology school, her brief enrollment in a real estate licensing program, and multiple credit card bailouts when her spending exceeded her income from part-time retail jobs. They told me Jessica was working hard to find her path and needed extra encouragement. Grandpa said his disappointment evident in every word. They told me you were naturally driven and would succeed regardless of financial obstacles. The scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. For 16 years, my parents had systematically diverted financial support intended for me, using it instead to fund Jessica's lifestyle, while constructing a narrative that painted me as independently successful and her as disadvantaged and deserving. I started questioning this arrangement about 6 months ago, Grandpa admitted. Something about the stories never quite added up. Why would a young man working multiple jobs and living in a studio apartment refuse financial help from his grandparents? Why would Jessica need constant bailouts despite supposedly having steady employment? I stared at the documents spread across his desk, each one representing years of struggle that could have been completely avoided. "They've been stealing from both of us," I said finally. "Taking your money and my opportunities, then creating a false narrative to justify the whole system." Grandpa nodded gravely. "I believe that's exactly what's been happening, and I suspect the SUV situation is just the latest example of this pattern." When we returned to the living room, the atmosphere had grown even more strained. Mom, Dad, and Aunt Sarah were clustered together on the sofa, engaged in what appeared to be an intense, whispered conversation that stopped abruptly when we entered. Jessica sat alone in the corner armchair, still cradling her injured wrist. "Well," Grandma Helen said brightly, clearly trying to restore some normalcy to the evening, "who wants apple pie and coffee?" "Actually," Grandpa said, his voice carrying a new authority that commanded immediate attention, "I think we need to finish our earlier conversation first." He remained standing while I took a seat on the ottoman near his chair, the folder of financial documents still tucked under my arm. The family arranged themselves like defendants awaiting a verdict. "Mason and I have been reviewing some financial records," Grandpa began slowly. "I've discovered some significant discrepancies in how support money intended for him has been handled over the years." Sarah immediately went on the offensive. "I don't appreciate the implication that we've done anything inappropriate with family money. We've always made decisions based on what was best for both children. Both children." I found my voice stronger now with Grandpa's evidence backing me up. "When exactly was I consulted about what was best for me?" Linda's face hardened into that expression I remembered from childhood arguments. "You've always been the responsible one, Mason. You don't need your hand held through every little challenge. Jessica requires more guidance and support because she's still finding herself. Finding herself with money that was specifically earmarked for my education and expenses." I shot back. "You're being incredibly selfish," Jessica interjected, her voice sharp with indignation. "Just because you've always been the golden child academically doesn't mean you deserve everything. Some of us have different strengths that need nurturing too." The irony of being called selfish by the person who had been receiving my stolen money for years was almost too much to process. But Grandpa wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's something else," he said quietly, pulling out a separate manila envelope. "Helen, do you remember when I asked you to clean out the old computer last month? The one we were donating to charity Saint Ambikyambias?" Grandma nodded, though she looked puzzled about where this was heading. Well, I discovered something troubling in the deleted files before we wiped the hard drive, Grandpa continued. Emails that Linda had written and apparently forgot to delete permanently. The color drained from Mom's face as Grandpa opened the envelope. Inside were several printed email conversations, the kind of evidence that would hold up in any legal proceeding. These are communications between Linda and various employers during Mason's job search last year. Grandpa explained, his voice growing colder with each word. Companies where Mason had applied for engineering positions and performed well in interviews. He handed me the first printed email, and I read it with growing horror. My mother had contacted the hiring manager at Peterson Engineering Group, the company where I had completed 3 rounds of interviews for a senior project manager position. In the email, she identified herself as my mother and expressed concerns about my reliability and emotional stability. She told them I had family problems that interfered with my work performance. I read aloud, my voice barely steady, that I had a history of abandoning commitments when things got difficult, and they should be aware of potential attendance and attitude issues. The room was completely silent, except for the ticking of Grandpa's antique mantel clock. I looked up at my mother, searching for some explanation that could possibly justify what she had done. "There are 3 more companies," Grandpa said grimly. Similar emails to Hoffman Construction Data Flow Systems and Mitchell Environmental Consulting. Each one sent after Mason had completed successful interviews, but before final hiring decisions were made. Dad finally spoke up, his voice hoarse with shame. "Linda, please tell me you didn't actually do this." But the evidence was irrefutable. My mother had systematically sabotaged my career opportunities, ensuring that I remained underemployed and struggling financially. The pattern was clear now: keep Mason failing, so Jessica's minimal achievements would appear successful by comparison. You destroyed my chances at jobs that would have changed my entire life trajectory. I said, the full weight of the betrayal settling over me like a suffocating blanket. You actively worked to ensure I would fail. Sarah rushed to defend her sister. I'm sure Linda was just trying to protect potential employers from making a mistake. Sometimes family members can see problems that outsiders miss. What problems? I demanded. What reliability issues? What emotional instability? What history of abandoning commitments? The silence stretched until Jessica, in a moment of stunning honesty, provided the answer. The ones Mom needed to create so I wouldn't look like such a screw-up by comparison. Jessica's accidental confession hung in the air like a confession extracted under interrogation. The masks were finally coming off, revealing the calculated nature of years of family manipulation. Grandpa David set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and reached for another folder from his study materials. Since we're apparently sharing difficult truths this evening, there's one more financial matter that needs immediate attention. He opened this folder to reveal bank statements and deposit records spanning the past 5 years. Mason, are you aware that I've been sending monthly checks specifically designated for your car insurance, student loan payments, and general living expenses? I stared at him in complete confusion. No, I've never received any direct financial support from you. Mom and Dad always told me you believed young people should be independent and make their own way. Quite the opposite, Grandpa replied, his anger now fully visible. I've been sending $300 per month for the past 5 years, specifically earmarked for your essential expenses. $15,000 in total. He spread out copies of canceled checks, each one made payable to Linda and Robert Morrison, with clear memo lines indicating for Mason's expenses, or Mason's car insurance fund, or Mason's student loan assistance. Every check had been deposited into my parents' joint checking account. Your mother convinced me that direct payments to you would be inappropriate because you were too proud to accept help, Grandpa explained. She assured me the money was being used exactly as intended and that you were grateful for the support, even though you didn't want to discuss it directly. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. While I had been struggling to make student loan payments and working weekend shifts to afford car insurance, my parents had been collecting money specifically designated to alleviate those exact financial pressures. $300 every month. I repeated slowly, calculating the impact those payments could have made. For 5 years, money that was supposed to help with the expenses that kept me working extra jobs and living in the cheapest apartments I could find. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unable to meet anyone's eyes. We thought it was better to help Jessica get established first, and then we would redirect the support to Mason once she was stable. Stable. I laughed bitterly. She's 26 years old and still requiring monthly bailouts for basic adult responsibilities. When exactly was this stability supposed to materialize? Sarah jumped to her daughter's defense. Jessica has been working very hard to build her career. Not everyone follows the same timeline for success. Working hard. The words came out sharper than I intended. She's had 3 different jobs in the past 2 years, failed to complete cosmetology school, despite thousands of dollars in tuition, and just destroyed her car in a drunk driving accident. What part of that demonstrates hard work? Grandpa pulled out another set of documents, these showing Jessica's actual financial history. Credit card statements revealed spending patterns that included expensive clothes, frequent restaurant meals, spa treatments, and luxury items that far exceeded her income from part-time employment. The money that was supposed to help Mason with basic survival expenses, Grandpa said slowly, has been funding Jessica's lifestyle inflation and repeated financial emergencies caused by irresponsible spending. Grandma Helen had remained quiet through most of these revelations, but now she spoke up with a clarity that surprised everyone. You've been lying to us for years about both children, creating false narratives to justify taking money from one grandchild to spoil the other. The accusations could no longer be dismissed or explained away. The evidence was overwhelming, documented in bank records and email communications that painted a clear picture of systematic financial abuse and emotional manipulation. I want every penny of that money returned, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. $15,000 plus interest for the money you stole and compensation for the career opportunities you sabotaged. Linda finally found her voice, though it came out defensive and sharp. You can't prove that those job rejections were directly related to my communications. Companies make hiring decisions based on multiple factors. Actually, Grandpa interjected, I contacted Peterson Engineering Group last week to inquire about their hiring process. The hiring manager remembered the conversation with Linda quite clearly and confirmed that her call was the determining factor in their decision to withdraw the offer. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about deliberate sabotage of my life opportunities, carried out by people who were supposed to support and protect me. I stood up from the ottoman, needing physical distance from the family members who had systematically betrayed my trust. The weight of evidence spread across Grandpa's folders represented years of calculated deception, but I could see from their expressions that they still expected to minimize the consequences through familiar manipulation tactics. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, my voice carrying a calm that surprised even me. For the past decade, you've been stealing money intended for my education and expenses, sabotaging my career opportunities, and creating false narratives to justify giving my resources to Jessica instead. Sarah immediately launched into damage control mode. Those are very harsh words for what was really just family financial management. We were trying to balance everyone's needs and create equitable support systems. Equitable. The word came out like a laugh. I worked 3 jobs during college while Jessica received thousands of dollars for failed career experiments. I've been taking ride shares for 3 weeks while she drives the SUV you gave me for my birthday. Where exactly is the equity in that arrangement? Robert finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. We thought we were helping both of you in different ways. Mason has always been so capable and self-sufficient. Capable and self-sufficient, I repeated. Is that what you call it when someone works 60-hour weeks just to afford basic necessities? When they live in studio apartments with broken heating because it's all they can afford? When they turn down social activities because every dollar has to go toward survival? The defensive wall around my family was beginning to crack. Grandpa's evidence had made denial impossible, but they were still trying to reframe the narrative in ways that minimized their culpability. You have to understand, Linda said, her voice taking on that pleading tone I remembered from childhood arguments. Jessica has always struggled more than you. She needed extra support to reach her potential. Her potential for what? I demanded. Crashing cars while drunk, failing to complete educational programs that other people paid for, living beyond her means and expecting family bailouts when the bills come due. Jessica had been growing increasingly agitated throughout this conversation, and now she exploded with a fury that revealed the entitled mindset underlying years of preferential treatment. "You think you're so much better than me?" she screamed, jumping up from her chair. "Just because you got good grades and finished college doesn't mean you deserve everything handed to you on a silver platter." Handed to me? I stared at her in disbelief. I earned a 4.0 GPA while working multiple jobs and living on $5 a day for food. What exactly was handed to me? The SUV for starters, Jessica shot back. Grandpa and Grandma bought that for you without even asking if anyone else needed reliable transportation. They bought it for my birthday because I graduated summa cum laude with an engineering degree. I replied. What did you graduate with? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica's face flushed crimson as she struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't highlight her lack of educational achievements. Not everyone is cut out for college, Sarah interjected quickly. Jessica has other strengths that are equally valuable, such as. The silence stretched uncomfortably as they searched for examples of Jessica's strengths that didn't involve spending other people's money or creating crisis situations that required family intervention. Then Jessica made the critical mistake that would finally expose the full scope of their deception. In her anger and frustration, she revealed information that no innocent victim would have possessed. "Fine," she yelled. "You want to know the truth? I've known about the money transfers for years. I knew Grandpa was sending checks for your expenses, and I convinced Mom and Dad that you didn't really need the help because you were already doing fine on your own." The room went completely silent. Even Linda looked shocked by her daughter's admission. "You knew," I said slowly, "that money intended for my basic survival was being redirected to fund your lifestyle." Jessica was too angry to recognize the trap she had walked into. "Yes, I knew, and I knew about the job interview calls too, because I helped Mom figure out what to say to make sure those companies wouldn't hire you." The confession hit like a physical blow. This wasn't just parental favoritism or misguided family financial management. Jessica had been an active participant in a conspiracy designed to sabotage my opportunities while enhancing her own. "You helped sabotage my career," I asked, needing to hear her confirm what she had just admitted. "We needed to make sure you stayed at your current level so I could catch up," Jessica said, apparently still believing her reasoning made sense. "If you got one of those high-paying engineering jobs, it would make my accomplishments look pathetic by comparison. Family dynamics require balance." Even Sarah and Linda appeared stunned by Jessica's casual admission of deliberate sabotage. The mask had finally come off, completely revealing a level of calculated cruelty that went far beyond simple favoritism. "You enjoyed watching me struggle," I said, the pieces finally forming a complete picture. "You knew I was working multiple jobs and living paycheck to paycheck, and you enjoyed it because it made you feel superior." Jessica's silence confirmed what her words had already revealed. This hadn't been about family financial management or different support systems for different children. This had been about systematically destroying one person's opportunities to artificially inflate another person's relative position. The room remained frozen in the aftermath of Jessica's confessions, but I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The rage and hurt were still there, but underneath them was a cold clarity I had never experienced before. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder I had brought with me, one that had been sitting in my car during the entire family dinner. Actually, I said, my voice steady and calm. I came here tonight hoping we could resolve this situation through honest family conversation. But since that's apparently impossible, we're going to handle this through more formal channels. I placed my folder on the coffee table and opened it to reveal legal documents, printed emails, and financial records that I had been collecting for the past 2 months. The expressions around the room shifted from defensive anger to genuine alarm. You see, I started noticing patterns in our family dynamics about 6 months ago. I explained pulling out organized evidence packets. Little things at first. Why I never seemed to get interviews for positions I was clearly qualified for. Why my parents always knew details about my finances that I had never shared with them. Why Jessica always seemed to have money for luxuries despite working part-time retail jobs. I handed Grandpa a thick stack of documents. With help from my friend Derek, who happens to be an attorney specializing in financial fraud, I've been documenting everything. Federal mail theft, since you were intercepting checks addressed to me from Grandpa. Interference with employment opportunities, which creates civil liability under several statutes. And fraud, since you were receiving money under false pretenses. The color drained from Linda's face as she realized the legal implications of her actions. You can't be serious about involving lawyers in a family disagreement. This stopped being a family disagreement when you started committing federal crimes, I replied calmly. Derek has already filed preliminary complaints with the Postal Inspector's Office regarding the mail theft, and he's prepared to pursue civil remedies for the employment interference and financial fraud. I pulled out another document packet and set it on the table. This is a detailed accounting of all money that was stolen from me, including the intercepted checks from Grandpa, the diverted college fund money, and my childhood savings bonds. The total comes to $43,000, not including interest and penalties. Robert looked like he was about to be sick. Mason, surely we can work something out without involving legal authorities. We can, I agreed, but only under very specific conditions that demonstrate genuine accountability rather than damage control. I pulled out a typed list from my folder. First, my SUV will be returned to me within 24 hours. Jessica can figure out her own transportation solutions like every other adult who makes poor decisions. Jessica started to protest, but Grandpa silenced her with a look that could have melted steel. Second, you will begin immediate monthly restitution payments for all stolen money with interest calculated at market rates. Derek has prepared a payment schedule that takes into account your current financial capacity while ensuring full repayment within 5 years. I pulled out another document. Third, you will provide written acknowledgement of your financial fraud and employment sabotage to every family member and family friend who has heard you criticize my work ethic or financial management over the years. Your reputation rehabilitation doesn't get to come at the expense of my continued character assassination. The list continued with specific requirements for behavioral changes, financial transparency, and ongoing accountability measures. I had learned from Derek that successful restitution required more than just financial repayment. It required acknowledgement of harm and consistent demonstration of changed behavior. Fourth, Jessica will enter a comprehensive addiction treatment program that addresses both alcohol abuse and the entitled mindset that enabled years of financial exploitation. Her continued access to family support will be contingent on her successful completion of this program and ongoing sobriety. Sarah started to object, but I cut her off. These aren't negotiation points. These are the minimum requirements to avoid criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits that would cost significantly more than voluntary compliance. I handed each family member a copy of the legal documents Derek had prepared. You have 48 hours to decide whether you want to handle this through family restitution or through the court system. After Tuesday at 5 p.m., the decision will be out of your hands. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. For the first time in my adult life, I held the authority to determine consequences for people who had spent years exploiting and manipulating me. I'm moving out of my apartment and cutting contact with all of you until you demonstrate through consistent actions that you're committed to making things right. I continued. Grandpa has my attorney's contact information if you have questions about the restitution process. I stood up and collected my folders, feeling lighter than I had in years. And just so we're completely clear, this isn't about money anymore. This is about justice. You spent years convincing me that my struggles were character building while you were actively sabotaging my opportunities. You made me believe I wasn't worthy of family support while you were stealing money specifically designated for me. That kind of psychological damage doesn't get fixed with apologies and promises. I walked toward the front door, then turned back one final time. The difference between justice and revenge is that justice seeks to restore balance and prevent future harm. If you choose the legal route instead of voluntary restitution, you'll learn that courts are significantly less flexible than family members when it comes to consequences for financial fraud. 3 months later, I found myself hosting Sunday dinner in my new 2-bedroom apartment in the Riverside District, a space I could finally afford thanks to the senior engineering position at Morrison Technologies that I had secured once the employment sabotage ended. The dining room table was set for 8 people, including Grandpa David, Grandma Helen, my college friend Derek, who had become like a brother through this process, and surprisingly, my parents and Jessica. The transformation in family dynamics had been remarkable to witness. Within 48 hours of my ultimatum, my parents had returned the SUV and signed Derek's restitution agreement. The monthly payments had been arriving like clockwork, deposited directly into an account that I monitored but didn't touch, allowing the balance to grow toward the full amount owed. More importantly, the behavioral changes had been consistent and verifiable. Linda had written letters to every family member and friend who had received her complaints about my work ethic, explaining that her criticisms had been based on incomplete information and acknowledging my actual accomplishments. The letters had been awkward and difficult for her to write, but they had restored my reputation within extended family circles that I hadn't even realized had been poisoned against me. Robert had enrolled in family therapy and anger management counseling, recognizing that his passive enabling of Linda's manipulation had been its own form of abuse. His transformation was perhaps the most surprising as he began to develop the backbone to speak up when family discussions became unfair or dishonest. Jessica's journey had been the most challenging. The addiction treatment program had forced her to confront not just her alcohol abuse, but the entitled mindset that had enabled years of exploiting family relationships. She had completed the initial 90-day residential program and was continuing with outpatient counseling and regular sobriety meetings. Tonight marked the first time in 3 months that we were all sharing a meal together, a milestone that Derek and her counselors had suggested as a way to practice new relationship patterns in a controlled environment. "This is delicious," Grandma Helen said, cutting into the herb-crusted salmon I had prepared. "I never knew you were such an accomplished cook. I learned out of necessity during those years of living on $5 a day for food," I replied with a smile that held no bitterness. Turns out financial constraints can build useful life skills. The comment would have triggered defensive reactions 3 months ago, but the family dynamics had shifted enough to allow for honest acknowledgement of past realities without immediate damage control responses. "I still can't believe we missed so many years of seeing who you really are," Dad said quietly. "I'm sorry it took a legal crisis to open our eyes." Jessica set down her fork and looked directly at me, something she had struggled to do during our first few supervised conversations. "I need to say something that my counselor has been helping me prepare for weeks." The table grew quiet, giving her space to speak without interruption. "I convinced myself for years that you didn't deserve the same support I was getting because you seemed to be succeeding despite obstacles." She began, her voice steady but emotional. But the truth is, I was jealous of your capabilities and afraid that fair treatment would expose how little I was actually accomplishing with all the advantages I was given." She paused to collect herself before continuing. "I actively participated in sabotaging your opportunities because I needed you to fail in order to feel successful myself. That's not just wrong, it's evil. And I understand now that real family love means wanting everyone to succeed, not tearing down one person to artificially elevate another." The acknowledgement was more complete and honest than I had expected, reflecting genuine insight rather than just words designed to restore family access. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, "and I appreciate the work you've been doing to understand how we ended up in such a destructive pattern." Grandpa David raised his water glass in a gesture that drew everyone's attention. "I want to propose something that Helen and I have been discussing. This experience has taught us about the dangers of indirect financial support and the importance of transparency in family relationships." He paused to make sure he had everyone's attention. "We've revised our estate planning to include direct trust funds for both grandchildren that cannot be accessed or redirected by parents. We've also established annual family meetings where all financial support decisions will be discussed openly rather than handled through private arrangements that create opportunities for manipulation." The changes represented more than just financial reform. They represented a fundamental shift toward accountability and transparency that would prevent future exploitation. More importantly, Grandma Helen added, "We've learned that love requires honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. We enabled harmful patterns by accepting explanations that felt convenient rather than asking harder questions about fairness and truth." As dinner wound down and we moved toward coffee and dessert, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 3 months. The engineering position at Morrison Technologies was everything I had hoped for when I was applying to companies 2 years ago before the employment sabotage derailed my career trajectory. The financial stability felt surreal after years of constant economic stress. But more than the material improvements, I had gained something I hadn't realized. I was missing the knowledge that I could advocate for myself effectively when relationships became exploitative or abusive. The legal intervention had been necessary, not just to recover stolen money, but to establish that I valued myself enough to demand fair treatment from people who claimed to love me. "There's something I want to share with everyone," I said as we settled in the living room with coffee and homemade apple pie. "This whole experience taught me that toxic family patterns can only continue when victims remain silent and isolated. The moment I started documenting the truth and demanding accountability, the entire system of manipulation collapsed." I looked around the room at faces that had become familiar again, but in healthier ways. I learned that loving family members sometimes means refusing to enable their destructive behaviors, and that standing up for yourself can actually create space for more authentic relationships. Sarah, who had been mostly quiet through dinner, finally spoke up. "I owe you an apology too, Mason. I knew Linda was handling family finances in ways that favored Jessica, but I convinced myself that it wasn't my place to interfere. I enabled the whole system by staying silent. We all learned something about the difference between conflict avoidance and genuine peace," Derek observed. "Real peace requires justice and fairness, not just the absence of open disagreement." As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Jessica approached me hesitantly. "Mason, I know I don't have the right to ask this yet, but I'm hoping that someday we might be able to have an actual brother-sister relationship, one based on mutual respect instead of competition." I considered her words carefully before responding. "I think that's possible, but it's going to require consistent demonstration that you've genuinely internalized these changes. Trust gets rebuilt through actions over time, not through conversations." She nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. "I understand, and I'm willing to do the work for however long it takes." After everyone left, I stood in my kitchen washing dishes and thinking about how profoundly my life had changed. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the dishwasher and the distant sound of traffic on the river bridge. For the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely peaceful about my family relationships. The experience had taught me that family dysfunction thrives in environments of secrecy and isolation, where victims are convinced that their mistreatment is normal or deserved. But truth and accountability can transform even the most entrenched patterns of abuse, creating opportunities for authentic connection based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. I had learned that standing up for yourself isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about creating healthy boundaries that protect everyone from their worst impulses. My parents' behavior improved dramatically when they could no longer manipulate situations through deception and favoritism. Jessica began developing actual life skills when family bailouts were no longer automatically available for every crisis she created. Most importantly, I discovered that self-advocacy isn't selfish when relationships have become fundamentally unfair. Demanding justice and accountability isn't cruel. It's necessary for creating space where genuine love can flourish without the poison of resentment and manipulation. The legal intervention had been uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it had forced rapid behavioral change that years of family discussions had never accomplished. Sometimes love requires courage to challenge destructive patterns, even when that challenge temporarily disrupts family harmony. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I felt grateful for the difficult journey that had brought me to this place of authentic peace. Family relationships built on truth and fairness were more satisfying than relationships built on manipulation and false narratives, even when the truth required difficult conversations and uncomfortable accountability. The story of our family's transformation reminded me that healing is possible even in situations that seem hopeless, but only when people are willing to face truth honestly and commit to genuine change. Real love requires the courage to demand better from people who matter to us, and the wisdom to know that enabling harmful behavior isn't actually helping anyone involved. That Sunday dinner marked the beginning of what I hoped would be decades of authentic family relationships built on respect, honesty, and genuine support for everyone's success. It had taken a legal crisis to get there, but the destination was worth every difficult step along the way. Now I want to hear from all of you who have made it to the end of this story. Have you ever experienced family favoritism that felt unfair or destructive? How did you handle situations where family members were treating you differently than others? What advice would you give to someone who's discovering that their family has been manipulating financial support in ways that create inequality? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because stories like this remind us that we're not alone in facing challenging family dynamics. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of similar situations you've witnessed or experienced, please hit the like button to help others find it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming family challenges and finding the courage to stand up for fair treatment. Finally, if you know someone who might benefit from hearing about how family manipulation can be successfully challenged, please share this story with them. Sometimes knowing that others have found their way through similar difficulties can provide the hope and courage needed to start advocating for yourself. Thank you for listening to this journey of family transformation and justice. I hope it encourages you to value yourself enough to demand fair treatment from everyone in your life, including family members who should be supporting your success rather than undermining it. Remember that loving relationships require honesty, fairness, and mutual respect. You deserve nothing less than authentic family connections built on truth rather than manipulation.